You're listening to a Soul One podcast.
All right, Taylor is off this week, so you know what that means.
The boys are back.
That was your cue.
Oh, hi.
I thought you were going to jump in a lot faster than you did. There.
Yeah, it's a Sunday. I'm a little slow today. We're waking our way through.
Okay, well, you did say the boys are back, so I can cue my song here. The boys are back, and they're running out of patience. Hey now, the Trek boys are back.
That sounds pretty damn good.
I'm not going to lie, Tyler. I was actually expecting you to jump in and be part of that song.
I was like, you need to give me some at least give me the notes in advance.
As a Star Trek fan, you should have just been more self-aware.
Frankly. Well, that's fair. That's fair. We'll get better as we go along.
this whole 55 seconds of this opening can just be kind of tossed out here. That was appropriate.
Well, good. It's just, if you need to trim the episode down, you know where to take it from.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, especially so because of the timing of this episode. This is our annual sort of reminder to potential new listeners because the school year has just started. Lots of people are coming to Queens, discovering CFRC, discovering local podcasts. This is kind of our introduction to Star Trek episodes on screening in Kingston. So most of them have probably turned off by now.
Yeah, it's like they didn't hear Taylor and they're like, well, this isn't why I show up. And then they they left. It's like for whatever they do at the beginning of undergrad nowadays.
Yes, it's gonna be a Star Trek episode, everyone. So turn off your podcast platforms and go for a walk.
It's nice out there.
Yeah, it's probably quite warm, actually.
Yeah.
We're talking Star Trek today, but we are closing a loop that we opened on this episode. I think because of a fan. No, did we do that on I don't remember why we made Taylor watch the pilot episode of Enterprise.
It was definitely requested for a long time to get Taylor in on a Star Trek episode.
But then I chose the wrong one and everyone got mad.
Yeah, everyone got real mad that you picked Enterprise out of all of them.
Yeah. Well, I just thought it was the most accessible, but we'll discuss it. So you've watched all of Enterprise, the entire four seasons. Mm-hmm. You do nothing else but watch Star Trek. So,
but very slowly,
very, very slowly. You slowly but surely get there. So you're going to talk about that today. We're going to have our review of the entire series of Enterprise, a show that went off the air in 2005. So we're talking about that just to be topical. And we're reviewing one episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
And it isn't the first one.
And it's not the pilot. It's season 2, episode 7, Those Old Scientists. So we're going to review that. So yeah, there's really no reason for anyone to be listening except probably people who are related to me.
Yeah. Hello, Mike's relatives. Nice to see you.
Yes, and everyone else will not listen because this is probably I would argue, Tyler, this is the most random Star Trek episode we've ever done, even for our hardcore Star Trek listeners, which we know we have them.
Yeah, at the very least, the Strange New World episode is somewhat topical. It came out a few weeks ago. Enterprise is in no way, shape, or form topical. There was some news thing that came out 14 days ago about how certain episodes took a long time to film in Enterprise because Scott Bakula's hair wasn't cooperating. Yes. That's the newest news we've had about Enterprise for the last decade.
Which is one of the reasons why they spend so much time on Anson Mount's hair for Christopher Pike. That's why it's always perfectly
immaculately coiffed.
Yeah, it's just it's not going anywhere because they just couldn't stand it. And if you notice from Scott Bakula's hair, he loses a lot of it later in the series.
Yes, he does. They make it a lot shorter.
They were we're just going to cut your hair really, really short to avoid this problem. The issues around Star Trek production is always pretty funny.
Oh yeah, it's fun because they are, they don't necessarily have the biggest budgets, especially Enterprise near the end. It's like they had kind of made some enemies, like unfriends, it's like in the studio in terms of the amount of money they were spending on cerertain things. It's like so there's sometimes where you can say like, oh yeah, that they could have spent a little bit more time on that, a little bit more money on that, but
and it's I think for the listeners out there, stick around for the fun analysis of what I still think is a very underrated Star Trek series. And I understand a lot of our Star Trek fans who are listeners were very unhappy with my choice to kind of introduce Taylor to this one, but we'll revisit that a little bit. But I still stand by it slightly. I've actually wavered a lot since people have complained because I listen and I'm like, probably should have just started with, the Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, or even people were like Voyager, like anything other than Enterprise. And maybe they're right, but I still think it was an underrated series. So I'm looking forward to talking about it because I think it's still more. I think you will agree that watching it is closer to watching the Star Trek that you and I both know and love than the new Star Trek that we get.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely still shares DNA with like the Voyager Deep Space Nine era of sci-fi. And then it also is like it was in this interesting position where it was trying to adapt to the new wish of the modern consumer to have like ongoing stories. They wanted their episodes to flow one into the other, and they didn't want to miss an episode because they wanted to figure out what was going to happen. But then they were also still trying to provide that kind of like episodic nature to Star Trek exploration that really allows you to look at a bunch of different ideas, like just set yourself down these characters into this new and interesting idea, develop the ideas and themes behind that idea, and then move on to something completely different next week. They were trying to find a balance between those two things. They took some big swings. Some of those balances did not work for me at all, and yet some of them actually worked out surprisingly well.
Yeah.
So I am excited to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis with Enterprise. I think it took some swings. It missed, but I'm thankful they tried.
Yes.
At least they were putting in an effort to do something and join in there. And I just think it's a bit of a better fit in. But we're also going to talk about some new Star Trek today. Star Trek Strange New Worlds. One particular episode that has a very unpredictable crossover, but it happened.
Also a big swing.
Yeah, also a big swing, connected to the other Star Trek show that is still ongoing, which is Lower Decks, the cartoon. So they've got a little connecting thread here between Lower Decks and Strange New Worlds. We're going to talk about that. And I think, again, we should probably preface this with, and I believe this is correct, Tyler, this was the first Strange New Worlds episode you ever watched.
Yes, I had seen clips, so I kind of knew that time travel already kind of featured into Strange New Worlds, like plot aspects. I know that like Christopher Pike had maybe had contact with the future in some ways that gave him a little bit more insight than he should have had.
I can explain that a bit. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. And then I also knew that like a lot of the other characters were still in there. Like I knew that like a young Spock was there, a young Nurse Chapel in there. I knew like kind of bits and pieces from different like clips that appear on different social media aspects, but this was the first time I'd actually seen a full episode from beginning to end, to the point that when I was watching the opening, which was animated, I was like, is this usually animated, or do they do this for the crossover with Lower Decks?
Right. Oh yeah, that's true. So you must for a second have been wondering, wait a minute.
Like, wait a minute. I literally was like, oh, that's an interesting stylistic choice that they would do the animation for the... No, wait. This is probably episode specific. So.
Yeah. Yes. And this episode is directed by Jonathan Frakes, William Riker himself, returning to direct. Yeah. I mean, hey, listen. This guy directs some of the best Star Trek stuff out there, but also he directs other things that are Star Trek that are not so good. But he's one of those big swings too. Like he directed arguably, definitely one of the top 3 or 4 Star Trek movies.
Oh yeah.
in First Contact. So
Yep.
he also did Insurrection, but he did First Contact, right? Like you can't forget that.
He did, and like he did some of the best episodes in Picard.
I would agree.
Like, so,
yeah.
you know, when like even the greatest batters in baseball only have like a 30% hit rate or something like that. So like, you know, Jonathan Frakes is doing pretty good.
I will say, for like, because looking at Star Trek directors specifically, he gets it. And I'm not even just talking about a story standpoint, which directors don't always have anything to do with. Sometimes they're just there to direct literally what's on the page. But it's just the way he uses the camera, the way he creates good moments, the way he freezes and stops on characters to allow them to react. Like, he's clearly an actor who's directing, who knows how to get good performances out of people. Like, I will say that about... I don't know if this is the first Strange New Worlds thing he said, but one thing I don't want to get into it too much because I want to talk about Enterprise first, but I do want to say this, Tyler. This episode of Strange New Worlds was the most subdued all of these characters have been in of the 3 episodes I've seen. So I saw
the one that overlaps with the cartoon characters.
That is correct. They were the least cartoony and the least acting like teenagers to a situation that I've seen in this show so far. Like, they were the most like adult.
Oh, that's probably because they were reacting to like the
children,
pretty much children from Lower Deck.
Well, yes, and I think so. That's part of my like hold on your horses on positive comments. Is this was now again? I don't know if they've evolved because again, I've only seen episode 1, episode 2, and then a smattering of clips later.
Yeah,
and maybe like a full episode here or there, like just little bits. And they like we've talked about on this show before, they act like they're teenagers. Whereas regular Star Trek not only behaves like adults. Like I came up with this recently, and you're a scientist and an academic, so you'll like this.
Yeah,
original Star Trek, Next Generation, like all the classic Treks that we like, that's like a university lens,
right?
Dissecting things with a thesis and walking through it and showing evidence and having a point at the end.
Yeah.
Strange New Worlds and New Trek is like high school.
Right.
Look at the explosions and how like great we're being, and look at these characters and look how crazy they are, and they're all wacky, and that's what you want. You want wacky, and we're gonna get in front of your face, and we're gonna tell a bunch of jokes, and we're gonna be really quick about it. Like, that's New Trek. So that's what I have decided to make it easier on my brain. New Trek is a high school student approaching one piece of material, and then the other one is someone who's like studying for their master's degree approaching the same piece of material.
Yeah. Like, I can even see that, like, unfortunately Enterprise does also have some characters that respond to things in very like high schooly methodologies. Like, some of the like personal conflicts that exist in Enterprise are just like 2 characters that I don't like you. I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, can we please like step away from Lieutenant Reed and his like issues with the Makos for a second? I don't need to have
I was wondering what you were talking about.
It's literally the only arc that he has in the entirety of season 3 is I don't like that these people are trying to get my job.
He hates the Makos the minute they step on board. That is exactly he's exactly the cool girl at school, and then the interesting girl just arrived, and he was like, oh, I don't like you because you're interesting and everyone's giving you attention.
Well, because like they bring in literal, like they're like, we need to bring in literal military people who are good at this. And I'm like, you do, because like the
which is smart.
Yes, because the unfortunate thing about every security officer and every Star Trek thing is that for a plot to exist, they need to be somewhat bad at their job. They need to be a little bad at preventing these things from happening so that the show can happen.
That was the one part of season 3 of Enterprise that I was like, yep, I get exactly why you're making that decision. And that's like a smart, almost like out of world, out of character decision to be like, you know, we should bring in the military. Yeah. Because this is a big threat and we need help. Like that was kind of I thought that made sense the way they kind of worked that into it.
Yeah, it is definitely one of those situations where they're like putting they're laying out their plan and you're going, okay. And then the military one is the other one where you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And then you're like, back to we're going to send this one ship, into this thing. And all our hopes rest on them. Okay. And we're going to send them some military guys. Yeah, okay, that part checks out.
Yeah, like, and they're like, hey, we're refitting the ship and doing other things. Okay, at least you're taking this seriously.
Yeah,
and I believe it more because there aren't many other ships. Like the Enterprise in Star Trek Enterprise is the only ship. Like it always never made sense in Next Generation, where it's like the Enterprise is the only ship around. Like no one can come help them with this situation. But in this, they kind of made it clear, like, yeah, we have to send you, but we're going to give you new torpedoes. We're going to give you new, like, you know, upgraded, like, not shielding, but like better hull plating. We're going to do all these things, and we're giving you the military. It's like, oh, you're taking this seriously. Like
that's good to know. I do remember Star Trek moments where they'd be like, they're the only ship in the quadrant. I'm like, in the whole quadrant, in the whole quarter of the Milky Way, there's only one
ship. And it's Kirk's Enterprise.
Exactly. I'm like, where are all the rest of them?
And it'll take them 9 hours to get there. Like, it's okay, we're gonna start there with Star Trek Enterprise. We'll back it up.
Yeah.
Can't just talk about the third season. So let's begin with just your overall thoughts. So we last left you, on this show at least, having watched the pilot with all of us, and then you dived into seasons 1 and 2, and that's kind of where we thought you were kind of in 1 and 2, and you were nearing the end of 2. So maybe start with just a recap there. What your viewing experience, like first 2 seasons, then talk about the third, then talk about the fourth. Because I feel like 1 and 2 is one thing, 3 and 4 are kind of different. And
I would actually like to put a very large wall in between 3 and 4 as well, to indicate that I feel those two things should be considered separate. It's like 1 and 2, season 3, and then season 4. Because 1 and 2, I had a really good time watching 1 and 2. There was a lot of good episodes in those, and I was getting like a feel for the characters. There was and quite very quickly, certain characters like Commander Tucker and Ensign Sato and Dr. Phlox, those three became they're all funny, they're relatable, they were charming, they were really great as the center of episodes, but they also could, if you added them into another character's story, they would always make that story better. They were great leads, great support. They were fantastic right across the board. Really liked them.
You didn't get, one of the things about, say, The Next Generation, for example, that you didn't get was you never got enough, Reginald Barclay type characters, where they're kind of they have their flaws. Because that's the one thing you can say about The Next Generation is everyone's kind of perfect. They're fully formed, perfect adults, which, again, is kind of refreshing and nice. But you're right, Sato specifically, her, especially at the beginning, her, aversion to space completely and just not being on board for being on the ship. I thought it was great. The captain essentially blackmailing her, they're friends, but kind of but that's how it would be. You would force your friend to come on this mission with you, and she does not want to be there. She is not a fan of this whole process, which I think is really funny.
Yeah, as someone myself who is an academic, really enjoys the exploration, the science aspect of this, but would hate a lot of this, the scary space aspect of space exploration. I really found that she was very refreshing. The second episode, which I think is called Fight or Flight, is all about her facing her fears of trying to and struggling through her emotional feelings of I don't belong here, I'm not good enough for this, which was all really great to see. Even later on, there'll be great moments. They're one of the many moments where they were all the ship had been taken over. They're all trapped in their quarters, and they somehow find a way to communicate to each other. And they're trying to come up with an idea of how we're going to fix this. And they're all talking about we can go up in the vents. But the vents are too small. I couldn't fit in the vents. But Hoshi can fit in the vent. And then it just
she's no, I don't want to do it.
She's she looks so unhappy as she slowly presses the button on the communicator. Isn't there some other way I can participate in this?
Yes, yeah. And it's so funny because she's sort of the anti Tucker, Trip, who just he doesn't want to be stuck in engineering. He just wants to be out on missions and doing things. His I always liked, especially thinking his constant asking the captain, who's his best friend, to bring him on missions. And it's it doesn't make sense. You're the engineer. Stay here.
We need you on the ship, but then they just keep on throwing him into other people's ships to fix them, and it's
yes, that's how dangerous. He gets out.
Yeah, exactly. It seems dangerous to put your lead engineer onto an unknown vessel, willy-nilly, unsupervised. They could just go to warp, and you're like, oh, well, that's
there's
unfortunate.
kind of like, to me, that's where you bring in the childlike wonder and like being a little naive, and you can get away with it because they literally don't know what they're doing because they've never done this before. So to me, that was kind of the right way to go back is, okay, we want to see what Starfleet was like when it didn't know anything. There's no prime directive. Like that doesn't exist. And to see like the constant mistakes that the captain makes, but then like Trip just literally insulting people by being too mouthy and kind of like going about his business and like just kind of getting involved in like species and everything. Like, again, like one of my favorite episodes, the co-janitor.
Yeah, that's a good episode.
Ruins the lives of and then basically everyone on a ship. Like but again, you're the way they handle the moral like quandary of being like, well, what is the right thing here? And coming out of it being like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. And I kind of like that. Like there is that, the episode where they lose the communicator on that planet.
Yeah.
I think it's Reed who like loses.
Once again, security guy has to be kind of bad at his job for the show to
happen. But they give him hell for that. Like he's like, because Reed's like coming from the military background, I thought was also kind of interesting because at the beginning there was a little bit of tension between him and other people of like how the ship should be run because he's kind of got that military background. Him being the person who loses the communicator or the scanner or whatever it was, like that is amazing. Like it's just the way they wrote that, like, oh, it'll be Reed who forgets it. Like that's just, it's, to me it was gold.
Oh, all the time. It's just always him messing up. Like it's like, and at the beginning, I actually really liked Lieutenant Reed because, yeah, you're right. He had this like tension about how the ship should be run. Like he was from an old military like a Navy background. Like his father was in like the Navy, and he kind of brought that with him, which makes a lot of sense. And it was really cool to see how like he was like a very different kind of character. He was like no nonsense, all about the job, and to the point that no one knew anything about him. Like there's a whole episode where like Hoshi spends the entire episode trying to find out what Reed's favorite food is so that the chef can
but no one in his life
birthday.
Has any idea.
Yeah, and not just the crew, no one. Like she goes back, she like talks to his parents, she talks to his sister, like she can't find anyone, and then she eventually does find it down. And it was like a great moment of him kind of like brightening up, like, how did you know? Like, is it, and him obviously being like pleased about this. And I'm like, this is going to be cool. I'm going to be interested to see how this character goes through. And then generally what would happen is he would show up in things just so he could fail at something, like, so that the episode could happen. And then also so he could be a little bit persnickety about different things. And then in the next episode, mess up entirely. And I'm like, how are you the same character? You were complaining about this lack of decorum in the last episode.
Well, and I think like one of the things that I liked about the first two seasons of Enterprise specifically was they did a really good job of giving us like Star Trek science-y episodes, but then a lot of character discovery episodes like Shuttle Pod 1. Where
that's my favorite episode. It is actually my favorite episode of the whole series, is Shuttle Pod 1.
I agree. Like Trip and Reed being stuck in a shuttle pod, thinking the Enterprise was destroyed and trying to figure out what to do. Like it's such almost the entire episode is inside this shuttle, and I think it was just so well done. Like that's the type of television I like, where you find innovative ways to tell a story by giving yourself a big restriction. Like, hey, we're going to be stuck inside this shuttle pod the entire episode. Restriction. How do we make that work? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's cool because like it was the beginning of their friendship, like Tucker and Reed, like they became like a nice duo throughout the course. It's like always going forward. It's like it was like we had talked in one of a previous episode about kind of like the Star Trek tropes that I really love, and one of mine is like the ones that take place entirely in space, just on some like weird new entity or like in a very small contained area, and like so Shuttle Pod 1 just like it checked off all those boxes. It was so good.
Yeah. And then moving kind of through the first two seasons and into the third. Talk about that journey, because the third season does take a bit of a twist and let our audience know kind of what that looked like.
Yeah. So then, the end of season 2, there's an episode where effectively this unknown entity is like shows up and just destroys half of Florida. It's like this kind of like a space satellite that shows up out of nowhere, and it's been apparently launched by this alien race called the Zindi. And it is revealed throughout the course of the episode that the Zindi have been told by some kind of like entity from the future that the humans are going to destroy them, and so then they need to do a preemptive attack. And
it's important to note that this all happens in like 23 whatever. Like it's Florida then, everybody.
Yeah.
Exactly. I know some of our listeners were like, "That's not much of a loss."
No, goodbye,
it's
Florida.
Not now. Yeah, it's not now. It's like 300 years in our future. I just wanted to put that. I knew some people might have been thinking that, Tyler. So I just wanted.
Well, yeah, that's fair, and also to note that like obviously our population is much more densely packed in the future, so like it is a massive casualty list, including Trip's sister as like and so it's just there's a lot of personal issues that are going with this, a lot of like just the idea of like Earth being attacked, about like what is Enterprise's role in this, the way that we kind of went out into space and like willy-nilly and announced ourselves to the world, and then something came calling when Enterprise was away, and so what is our responsibility for this as a ship, and how are we going to make this right? And everyone kind of falling into this like pseudo jingoistic aspect of like we need to go and we need to like pretty much like destroy these things before they come and destroy us, which like at the time was probably a very interesting like kind of theme to be having, because I believe that would have been in like the mid 2000s, just post 9/11, where the US was
like
very much in that
2003 maybe.
Yeah. So it's like it's very much in this kind of idea, right, of like we were hurt, we need to go and hurt them back. It's like, and so the idea for that, and for this going to be like, this is a season wide arc where we're going to go, and the whole thing is the Enterprise all alone in this thing called the Expanse, which is where the Zindi live, which no one's been able to penetrate because of these like temporal distortions that destroy ships as they go in. We're going to go in there, and it's all on us. We need to find a way to stop the Zindi from before they launch their next weapon that's going to be able to destroy all of Earth. It's a very cool setup. I was intrigued. I waddled into season 3. It was like very very optimistic of what we were going to have, because once again, Enterprise has been all about trying to balance these two things: ongoing story versus episodic nature. We had this temporal Cold War like thread that we had been pulling on for a very long time. We have this episodic nature. It's like now we're going to come together in this way of like, we are obviously doubling down on the fact temporal Cold War is coming to us. Time travelers are somehow doing something, and we're going to go and see what's going on here. So I was very jazzed for it going into it. I very quickly realized what was going to be the problem for me, which is when if you have this pressing story of like, we need to go do this now. Every time you have an episode where they're just kind of like, what's going on this planet? It just feels like, why are you like? It's like,
why are you stopping?
And even the characters are doing that. They're like, we don't have time for this. We got to go on our mission. I'm like, I can't just sit here and enjoy your wonderful tale about these random aliens on this planet because I'm too busy worrying about this Zindi over here. Like, you can't balance those two things in that way.
Like, I think they tried. They tried really hard to come up with reasons for why. Like, one of the episodes I did kind of enjoy was the old sort of Western town that they end up visiting. It kind of reminded me of the original series a bit.
It's like a very old Star Trek thing. It's like, we don't know what to do. Throw them in the Old West.
Throw them in the Old West. And like, I kind of liked that episode for its like message, but the way the message was delivered, and that idea of, hundreds of years ago, humans were taken from Earth, brought to a planet by aliens to be their workforce. They revolted, and now they have like sort of developed kind of along the similar lines of Earth was, but with some variations. And the idea of this other alien species is kind of living there, but they're like really like they're in slavery basically to the humans. So having like the crew of the Enterprise have to deal with that, and their reasoning for going down is, we're in the middle of an expanse that humans have never been to, and we found a planet of humans. We need to go check this out. Like, that was the most realistic. But then there were plenty of episodes where they stopped to have like an episodic, like sciencey episode, and you are kind of going like, aren't we close to a weapon being launched? Like, haven't we been hearing about this? So that was definitely a problem. There were still a few episodes in there that felt very like Star Trek to me. Yeah.
So like one of my favorite episodes in the whole like show is actually in season 3. It's called Similitude. It's like Similitude.
Oh yes, yeah.
It's the one where like it's like Commander Tucker is fatally wounded He's going to die, and they can't have that because he's like the only thing keeping the ship together. And if they lose him when they're in the Expanse, there's a good chance they won't be able to complete their mission. So Archer agrees to do this like kind of very controversial medical thing where they grow this clone of Tucker that will grow up to his age in like a week or 2 weeks, and then they will take parts from him and put it into it's like the actual trip to bring him back to life, but at the expense of the other entity's life. So it's like a very interesting. It's one of those situations where the ticking time clock on this mission actually works because they would never make these decisions without that ticking time clock. Of like need to get to the Xindi, need to go and just like figure this thing out. And at the same time, it still allows them to look at a lot of interesting moral quandaries and like they do a lot of cool things with the characters, how it makes Archer feel about him having to make these decisions, how it makes Phlox feel about having effectively raised a son in the course of like a week, how this new version of Trip interacts with T'Pol and his uncertainty of whether his feelings for her are his own or belong to the other Trip from the past thing. Like lots of cool stuff in that episode. It's that episode I was like, this is really good. Like they're doing great work here.
Yes, and that's a fantastic episode.
Yeah. And then for every one of those, there's like another one where it's like, they're just wandering around doing some other inane nonsense. And you're like, what is Degra up to? It seems like he's doing something bad and we should get over there soon.
Well, and I again, there were aspects of the third season I liked. Like I like that they're like, okay, we're going to take away one of the strongest assets that this ship has had in T'Pol and like hurt her by being here. Like her reaction to the stuff that they need to put the Trillium D or whatever that they need to put in the hull to protect them from all the spatial distortions. Like that really like kind of like took a big chunk out of her, which by weakening her, it raised the stakes a bit. Where you're taking your strongest, wisest, like the person who's kind of been stable, and you're throwing emotional impacts at her, and she doesn't know how to handle it. And unlike Spock, who was half human, who a part of him could handle emotions, she can't. Like this is so foreign to her that I liked her like trying to just explore her emotions and discover it and try to like figure out what all this means. But I thought that was kind of a cool character thing for her to go through. And like again, like some of the acting in this season is pretty good. Like you talked about the Sim episode, like playing a sort of younger version and more naive version of yourself, that could be pretty tough. And I thought that like Connor Traynor, who's the actor who plays Trip, did a fantastic job. And I think it's the same with T'Pol. Like I think she did a good job of really changing things up for that season.
Yeah, like I agree. She got some good stuff. Like Archer's whole like moral quandaries was great. Like Trip had some great episodes. The other problem with season 3 though is that they forgot about like the other half of the characters. Like
yes,
like
100%.
like Hoshi gets like one storyline, which is like a weird Beauty and the Beast kind of like homage thing, which is weird, really bad. Like Travis, he is piloting that ship real good. He doesn't do anything else.
Travis has nothing to do after the second season.
No, like he has, like even in the first couple seasons, he only has like a few stories. My favorite moment of Travis ever is that when they focus on how young he is, because him and like Hoshi are much younger than a lot of the other people. Yeah, and so they become close friends, and that's always cute to see. But it is funny that there's like this one moment where it's like there's something happening. Everything's like falling apart on the ship. So all of the rest of the major like crew, all of the other officers are off the bridge. When this alien shows up, demanding to speak to who's in charge. And literally it's like Travis in the center, and he looks to his left, no one there. He looks to his right, no one there. So he just like has to like, it's that moment of like panic of, oh my God, I need to answer this.
Yeah, that was pretty good. The look on his face of like, what am I doing? What, I have to do this?
It was so great. And like in those type of moments, he's just like, he's missing. Though that's completely missing from season 3. You don't see that at all. And so that's kind of sad, because once again, that ticking time clock of like the main story means that you can't really have time to focus on some of those type of moments, some of like fun little character bits. It just has to be Scott Bakula doing his weird marching around rooms shoulder first as he yells at walls about how unhappy he is about what's going on.
Yes, yeah. He must complete this mission. That was his line.
He must complete this mission.
I must complete this mission. That was he's just running around the Enterprise yelling that. And everyone's like, yeah, we know, like, we're here, but you made us stop at the planet with all the cowboys.
Yeah, it's like, I agree we need to start this mission. It's like, except for that time that you're really focused on that hatchery. Then it became, we need to protect the hatchery.
Yeah, we need to protect the hatchery. Yeah.
It was so funny. My wife was not watching this with me, but like it was on in the background every so often. And like halfway through season 3, at one point when Scott Bakula is doing his like yelling at walls thing as he like marches around the room, it's like my wife was just kind of like, why is he always angry all the time?
So that's one of the things that I think they never really got Archer out of through because even at the beginning he's always angry at the Vulcans.
Yeah.
I felt there were moments in the first 2 seasons where you got the sense of like, oh, this guy loves exploring, and you got some of that like joy of it, especially when he was like on planets and like exploring things. Like you got some of it, but I felt like they needed to finish and complete a full arc with him to make him no longer angry at Vulcans, and then give him a new thing with the Xindi and have him arc through that where he gets to the end. Because one thing they did do at the beginning of like the 4th season was the weight of everything that happened. I thought they did a good job with a few episodes, like when he goes camping with that other.
With the other captain,
the other captain, you get his perspective of like everything that happened and how awful he feels about it, and how like it's kind of turning him almost to the dark side. Like you can see the anger coming through and him trying to deal with it. And I thought that was very good, but I just think they never did enough to be like, okay, he can't just be yelling and angry all the time, which seemed to be Archer's character a lot in the series.
Yeah, and like that episode you're referring to, like, which I think is called Home, the one where they go like back to Earth and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's I love aftermath episodes. We've talked many times about how like Best of Both Worlds is followed up by like a great aftermath episode of just them all going and dealing with what just transpired. And so when we were getting to the end of season 3 and everything like, goes the way that it does, they do defeat the Xindi weapon. It's actually like a very like, for all of my complaining about season 3, like once I got into that final like 6 episode stretch of like we're into it now, like I'm like, okay, this is good. Like this is like you package this together, this would have actually made a pretty decent like Star Trek movie. Like is
100%. Yeah, those 6 episodes like near the end, that would have made a fantastic movie.
Because it's got like some diplomacy aspect, it's got that, but then like it goes south, there's all these type of things going on. They remember that Hoshi exists, which was nice. It's like and then but then like after all that, like you have this great aftermath episode. I'm like, oh, that's great. Except that's not what happens. In between that aftermath episode and the end of season 3, you have this weird 2 episode portion where they go back in time to face the vampire Nazis.
Well, yes, of course. You've got to go back to World War II at some point in time.
This is the classic hero's journey where you go through. You got the journey home, and then before you have the returning with the elixir, you have the fighting vampire Nazis. It's right there in Joseph Campbell's epic work.
You know what they were missing? They were missing. When that moment when they discover, like, because Archer's, they think Archer's dead, but he's on this Earth back in time. They've been sent back in time. You're missing that character moment. Like maybe it should have been Travis, who wasn't saying anything, to just like bang his hand on the table and be like, "Come on, we just did this. Do we have to do this again?" Like that to me, that's what you were missing to kind of make it like more self-aware. Like, why are we doing this? Like this, that ridiculousness of it.
Oh, it was just insane to me. Like that was a baffling decision to my point. Like from this temporal Cold War story that had been present in like seasons 1 and 2 throughout the entirety, pretty much put on hold for season 3, and then they decided to just like finish that up in like a 2 episode arc at the beginning of season 4, while it detracted from what we had just seen. Like we didn't have time to decompress from that. It didn't fully pay off all of the stuff that had been in seasons 1 and 2. Like we never really got an answer to like who the person was that was telling the Suliban to do things. Like it was the most baffling decision. And I watched those 2 episodes, which fine episodes in themselves, but just like with my like hands on my face, like in shock, like I can't believe you're doing this to me. Like, I
They-
just
Their
got through this.
their team got obsessed with needing cliffhangers. Like that's one thing that Star Trek started doing and felt they needed at the end of every season. Because even Voyager and Deep Space Nine and TNG all started doing it. It's all because of Best of Both Worlds. Best of Both Worlds is what did it. It was the cliffhanger that started all the cliffhangers. So they went, well, we can end the Xindi thing, but we've got to leave people wondering what's going to happen next. How is Archer on ancient Earth? Like, how did this happen? Like, those sorts of things they thought they needed. But I agree with you. It's so out of place to kick off like what would end up being their final season.
It was ridiculous.
So maybe talk about that quickly. So now we're into season 4. What were your kind of thoughts on the 4th season and then kind of ending the series?
Like, low-key, I love this season. It was my favorite of the 4 by far.
Really? The 4th season, okay.
The 4th season, I think they
has some good moments. It has some episodes, yeah.
I think it was incredibly strong, and for me, it was because they finally did it. They finally found the balance between the two things they were looking for in this format of having mini arcs. Like, you had 2 to 4 episodes, which were all in the same story. So you could really flesh out and focus on this new interesting idea while still having an ongoing story that will bring people back week after week for like 3 to 4 weeks. And then they would shift gears into this new mini arc that they went through. And the mini arcs were really good in terms of like both providing closure to what Enterprise had kind of set up in its first couple seasons. So that's with like the Vulcans not being what we expect them to be, the Andorians, and like their like how humans are going to play a part in bringing this portion of the galaxy together.
Those episodes were quite good. Like the Enterprise being in negotiation mode. Those episodes are great, and the kind of like unknown mystery threat of really being Romulans, but then not knowing that of that ship and not knowing like all that stuff was really well done. Yeah.
And finding a way to play that off and is like so that they still they don't actually see the Romulans ever, like which is like something that is like obviously they paid attention to like the original series in terms of like they hadn't seen Romulans like ever, so they didn't know what they looked like.
I finally get to ask you though about this very quickly. We got the explanation as to why Klingons don't have forehead ridges. How'd you feel about that?
Like. You know what? It's one of those scenarios where, like, I don't feel like you needed to explain this. The explanation was clear. They didn't have the makeup in the 1960s to be able to do this. I think Deep Space Nine's kind of, like, one-off of we don't talk about it. It's, like,
that was enough.
Yeah. But, like, it was a very intriguing mystery around it. So, like, it was one of those funny things.
Still, like, a really good couple episodes, though? Like, even though that thing was just, like, those episodes was pretty good. Like, they were pretty good.
It was hilarious because I didn't understand what was happening. Like I was looking through and I'm kind of going and I'm like, okay, it's like, and then as we're getting close to the end and I'm like, okay, that's weird that they have the Klingons without the ridges. That's a strange thing. And it kind of makes sense, I suppose. They're using this like, this kind of like augment brain as like a DNA that was from humans. So it's why it's getting rid of it. I'm like, that makes sense. And then it wasn't until like the last like 5 minutes as they're explaining, like there will be thousands of my people that will have to live with this deformity. And I'm sitting there like, oh my god, this whole episode is just so they can explain why the Klingons didn't have ridges in the original series.
Yeah. And it is at least the explanation of it is worthwhile to justify Worf being like, we don't talk about it with 2 outsiders.
Yeah, it does make sense.
It does make sense. I just didn't need it.
Yeah, this is like midi-chlorians in Star Wars. Like, you didn't need to do that. It was okay, George. We kind of got it.
It's the Force. We get it. Like, it's unspeakable. Okay, wrapping up that season. How did you feel with, the show ending and the rest of this season, and then just kind of finalize with how you felt about Enterprise in general?
Cool. So the very last episode, I am very ambivalent about. Like, I have very strong positive and negative feelings towards it.
Would it be helpful to know that it was rushed and like they didn't know they were ending the show, like they were canceled and quickly?
I definitely
together a final episode. Okay,
it's one of those scenarios where like this episode is like would have been a great episode if it was like mid-season, like a mid-season episode about this. I'm like, that's a great idea. The whole idea is that you have Riker who's in the middle of like the issue with the USS Pegasus back in TNG. He's trying to decide if he's going to tell his Captain Picard about the thing that he promised he would never talk about. And he's like, Deanna has suggested that he goes into the holodeck to relive this portion of the Enterprise crew's life as like, it's like a 10-year time jump from the episode prior to this or something like that. Like maybe a 7-year time jump or something like that. and is just before like the Federation is going to come into kind of its infancy. And so like throughout this whole thing, Riker is just like walking around in the NX-01. And then it's like, it was really good payoff in some ways because he subs in for the chef, who is like someone we've heard about so many times that the chef's unhappy about this. The chef's trying to figure this out, but we never actually saw the chef. So I like to think in my head that like the chef is the go-to position, that if you want to like pretend to be on the NX-01, you just go in as the chef.
Yes, exactly.
And so like throughout the course of this entire like show, I like to believe like, okay, maybe at one point Geordi was the chef for a bit, or like it's like, all these different people. It's like doing that. But through all of that, you get this really interesting idea of looking at like legacy and like an objective observer of like showing how Riker knows these people, knows these people's lives, knows their stories and their personalities in a way. These people are famous because what we just saw is like the bedrock for everything that we've seen before. It was a really cool way to ground Enterprise in like the context of what it should be, which is that nothing else exists if this crew didn't do what they did. If these people didn't like perform their tasks, their goals, their professions the way that they did, if they didn't push through like that, then we wouldn't have gotten Kirk, we wouldn't have gotten Picard, we wouldn't have gotten any of this. It's like, and who knows what it would have been. So it was a really cool way of setting that legacy in place, and also providing this idea of like this a little bit dramatic irony where Riker knows a little bit more about what's going to happen, can kind of set you on can make some offhand comments like, it's so sad that this character didn't know that they weren't going to come back from this. And you're like, say what? And so like all of that sort of stuff is really cool. The negative feeling I have about this is that to take the finale, the actual finale for a series of the characters that you've grown accustomed to, that most of them you like, some of them you don't, but that's all right. And then to take all those people and to have their final flight, their final moment to like explain to you like who they are and why this mattered to them, to put it into this like existential dread thing of it just being suspended in time in a holodeck aspect, to have the whole episode being leading up to this idea of these characters' moment of triumph, and we're all watching it from the middle of another episode in the middle of another series that we've already seen and we already know what the decision comes down to. To take it away from them like that, to have it that Archer doesn't even get a chance to say his speech, that they end program before we get to hear what speech he was going to give, like all of this sort of stuff. It would be a really cool idea to put that as like an interesting middle of season episode that really puts a lot of things into context. Even if you were going to kill off a main character and you wanted to find a way to make it impactful, like this is a good way to do that in the middle of a series. To put it as the finale, I think was just like a slap in the face to like everyone who was in that show, to be like, it's like, in order to get these ratings up, we're going to bring these people back that were more popular than you and set your story within the context of their entertainment. I just find that to be terrible.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like the show was canceled so suddenly, and apparently without much warning. Like they knew they were in some trouble. The story from going back, and even from what I remember, because I was watching the show weekly, was that the fourth season was still performing better than the third was. Like they felt they were back on track, and everyone felt good, and they had started planning a fifth season, and they then were suddenly canceled, like out of nowhere, being like, you can film one more episode, and they had to fight for that. They had to fight to film an actual finale. So they probably, I honestly think it was a sense of, we got to tell a big story, an epic story, very fast. We've got to shove a bunch of character stuff in there. We got to give every character a nice little moment, and we've got to like just end this thing. So it felt more, to me, it felt more like an ending for Star Trek of the time than it was for the show Enterprise. Like it felt to me that this episode, as much as there are good things in it, feels nothing but like negative to me. It feels like a sad goodbye, like we were literally at someone's funeral. Like that's what it felt like. Where you're saying goodbye to classic Star Trek. What we didn't know was probably forever. Yeah. And that's kind of, to me, one thing I'll always remember about this episode was I love this series. And I think the series is really underrated. But the way they ended it was essentially to end Star Trek.
Yeah. And it does feel like that. And it's especially interesting to have like I think, there's there's like Enterprise has a lot of like, you know, like attempts at like really intense emotion, and some of it worked for me and some of it didn't. But you know, it is like it was like primetime television. There's a lot of melodrama that exists in that sort of stuff. I think that this series, like this episode, did have one of the few moments that really like caught me off guard and how emotional I was going to get in terms of Riker's like conversation he has with Trip, who comes in to add like, because the whole thing is that like as the chef, he's like making everyone's favorite meal for their last thing, and he's having this conversation with Trip about like, you know, what his final things, and like Trip is like, you know, doesn't realize that he's not going to make it back from this next mission.
Yes.
And he's just talking about what he's going to be doing and he's going through. And it was just like, it was like what you said. It was like almost bidding farewell to someone at like a funeral, recognizing that you're never going to see this character again, not just because they're about to die, but because this show is over. And then that's just kind of like the end of it. And
which sucks because he was such a fan favorite, and they obviously did that. Like they did that for a reason. They're like, okay, what's the most impactful thing for fans, but also for Archer, right? Yeah. So I get it, but it definitely, like, again, if that was just in this show and it lasted for 7 years, and one of the last things we got in season 7 was Trip dying, I think it would have felt one way, where it was like, the emotional impact's massive, but it doesn't have all these layers to it of just like, this was like really emotional and well done, but it's also kind of like you're doing this to cheap. The whole like enterprise. Yeah, it is like very, very cheap, and that's what it came off as. Yeah,
and I feel that, and in some ways, I guess it works for me because like I've always had this thing in my head about like, you know, it's a little bit depressing to say, but like the only happy ending, you only get a happy ending in a story because you ended it too early. Because eventually, like everybody's story ends the way that Trip's ends, is like in some way. It's like hopefully it's after 85 years at least. It's like warm and snuggly in your bed, as opposed to getting blown up as you're trying to defend your ship from something. But at the same time, like I think because there was a time gap, and because we're like looking at it from Riker's perspective of kind of just looking in at a moment in time, it create like the kind of randomness of it, the almost like offhanded like, and then he just died. Kind of like it made me think a lot about that, about how these characters, like if they get a happy ending, it's because that's when the show decided to end. But if we think of them as actual people, all of them are going to go forward and eventually meet their ends in one way or another. And it just kind of like, it's interesting to think about that in terms of how like we got to see one of them, but if the characters actually exist in space and time and history, all of them have a holodeck, it's like recording of their last mission in some way.
Yeah. It was such an interesting story, this series being ended so soon. So overall, where would you kind of rank it from the other Star Treks you've seen? What do you kind of feel about Enterprise now that you've gone through and like finished it?
Like it's one of those scenarios where like if season 3 didn't exist, this show would probably be, I'd prefer it over Voyager. Like I did actually really like most of the characters. There was no character that I thought was actually like a waste of space. Even the ones that I didn't like there was no Neelix. even the characters that I didn't really like, I was still kind of like, okay, but like, you know, they can sometimes make other people's stories better, or they're like a vital part of this whole thing. Season 3 really does drag it down a little bit for me, and it's a shame because it's like, it's not even like there aren't good things about it, and it has a very strong ending. It's like barring the vampire Nazis, it's like, I would say that this show and Voyager, like, I would have to rewatch Voyager to give a proper estimate, but I think the two of them are like neck and neck. Like I could see this one being able, with maybe another rewatch and a little bit more nostalgia, is like looking in the rearview mirror. I think this one could actually win out as they go over it. So I agree with you. I think this is it's like an underrated Star Trek series, and I was very happy that I finally got to see it all through.
Yeah, I really do think that, and that's why I've wanted to talk about Enterprise a lot. I've wanted to kind of spotlight it. It's why I wanted to introduce Taylor to it. This was the most recent one. It's the most accessible because it's the closest one to who we are now. So there's things that are somewhat recognizable. Like even the ship looks more submarine-like than it does spaceship. Like it's a little bit closer to our technology. So I felt like the gap for sci-fi wasn't as big. But I do feel like it's such an underrated show because they did a good job of focusing on, we're going to develop some really interesting characters. And, you know, again, they only had a couple seasons. I think if they had continued on, then maybe we would have been able to go back to some characters and give them more of a due, and go back and give Travis Mayweather more to do, and go back to some good Hoshi storylines. Like I think
Yeah.
they would have been able to do that. But unfortunately, the way we judge television and success has changed. If Enterprise was on now, it would never go off air because Discovery is spewing out garbage and won't leave. So,
despite Mike's best efforts, it won't leave.
Did you know? And this is a real. I looked this up. For the third season of Discovery, when it launched, its pilot episode was watched by 1,500 people.
That's okay.
That's not it. I've sold more theater tickets than that. Like my amateur production of Cabaret sold more tickets than that. Like you got to be kidding me. Anyway, it's just any chance that I can take a shot at STD. I do.
I love it.
So Tyler, unfortunately, we've run out of time.
This is not unexpected, really, for us.
I wanted to talk about Strange New Worlds. I wanted to talk about that episode. We ended up talking mostly about Enterprise. So, you're just going to have to come back, and we're going to have to talk about Strange New Worlds on another episode, because you're going to have to come back, and we're going to have to talk about this. Yeah,
well, if that's what is demanded by yourself and the gods of screening in Kingston, then I will happily submit.
I mean, I don't know. As we know, our fans for the Star Trek episodes are small but mighty. Yep. So we'll find out how this episode does. But we're just gonna have to come back because we just didn't have enough time. But I don't think this was time wasted, because I do think that Enterprise, if you like Star Trek and if you're a sci-fi fan, there's a lot of good here.
Yeah.
I would argue, if you look at all, I don't know how many, like 90 something episodes in the 4 seasons. I would say, 80% of them are still worthwhile for episodes of Star Trek, for fun episodes of television. So if a few people gives, Star Trek Enterprise a chance, you can find it on all the streaming platforms. And it finally started admitting that new Star Trek is poison. Then I think that it's time well spent. And I think that was my hope. And that I feel like I've done that. You are a Star Trek fan who didn't watch Enterprise, and now you admit it was pretty good. Yeah,
it was worthy of my time. It's like I wasn't watching a lot of TV at the time. I'm still not watching a lot of TV, admittedly. I'm not a very good Star Trek fan in that regard. But I do feel like it has a bad rap, and that's the thing that I feel we can fix. It's nowadays is that if we kind of throw off our old ideas that and that's the show that killed Star Trek. And I'm like, it shouldn't have. If it killed Star Trek, it was simply because times had changed, people were moving on, and they had Star Trek episodes had been on the air for how long at that point? 18
since
years,
87. Yeah, since 87 to 2005 about.
So I think it was when Star Trek went off, Enterprise went off the air, it was the first time in 18 years that there hadn't been a new Star Trek episode coming out or in production. People might have just kind of got fed up. Other things were coming out. They were moving away from it. It's I don't think it was Enterprise's fault, and I feel like we nowadays can go back and enjoy it for what it is, while new Star Trek continues to do whatever the heck it is.
And we'll talk more about that later. Thank you again, Tyler, for filling in and for bringing that Star Trek knowledge to Screening in Kingston once again.
Perfect. I would anytime.
Thank you to everyone for listening, and hopefully you stuck around after that rough opening. Tyler will work on his timing for music. I
don't think I will. I think this is my style. I'm going to own it.
Okay, all right. You'll hear from us next week, and as Taylor says, go see some movies. Thank you for listening to You Had Me at Skip It, a Soul One Arts Inc. podcast. This podcast is produced by Mike Shepard and Austin Spinner Summer. It is a project of Soul One Arts Inc. To learn more about Soul One and all the great work that Soul One is doing in the arts community, especially in film, theater, and other performing arts, visit soul1arts.ca. You can contribute to this podcast by visiting soul1arts.ca and going to the podcast tab. You'll find all the information on You Had Me at Skip It and how you can get your questions read on air each week. Thank you again for listening.